What's up, YouTube? This is True Raw for TV. In this video, I want to focus on a very controversial rapper who also, unfortunately, had a very controversial end to his life. He's not a household name, but he put out in the early 1990s one of the most scathing diss songs in hip hop history. All right. And even though most people think that the East Coast West Coast beef started with Biggie and Tupac, it actually sort of began to be kicked off by this song that he put out. And it was a song called Fuck Compton. Okay. Um, it didn't just come out of the blue. There's some history behind this song. Okay. Um, Let me say this. Even though hip hop didn't exclusively start on the East Coast or New York, there was pockets of hip hop everywhere throughout the country. But it definitely still got most of its origins and start on the East Coast and New York. That was like the epicenter of the hip hop culture. Okay, and for the for most of the 1980s, we saw that. We saw the East Coast dominate hip hop. However, by 1990, there was a shift. Okay, there was a shift to where we saw groups like NWA, for example, um, DJ Quick, Most Wanted. Um, you think about the first part of the 1990s, Death Row, after the breakup of NWA, Snoop Dogg, even Tupac Shakur, who started off as a New York-based rapper, but he's now, of course, more affiliated with the West Coast than he is with the East Coast because of his association with Death Row and Suge Knight and the East Coast West Coast beef. So for a long period of time, the West Coast did dominate hip hop culture, even when it comes to movies. Look at the movies, and the way they talked and the way they dressed. Uh, Boys in the Hood, South Central, uh, Friday, a comedy. Um, other uh, sort of gang banger movies, you want to call it that, right? There was definitely a West Coast vibe, and it had overtaken hip hop, and a lot of people on the East Coast resented that. Don't Be a Menace is another one. When you look at the way they're dressed, the way they talk, it's definitely dominant. It became dominated by the West Coast culture. L.A. Raiders, um, khaki pants, palm trees, and nothing wrong with that. You know what I'm saying? California is beautiful, but New York felt like it was disrespected. And Temp Dog, Temp Dog tapped into that resentment that was there from a lot of New York hip hop artists. And this is an animosity which Tim Dog would tap into via the release of his groundbreaking first single. Frustrated at the apparent lack of interest in East Coast artists from record companies, Tim recorded Fuck Compton, which was a scathing diss track from his debut album Pencilin' on Wax. Fuck Compton attacked the city's style of dress and musical output and made threatening gestures to several Compton rappers, including Eazy-E, MC Ren, Ice Cube, and Dr. Dre. Tim Dog would later exclude Ice Cube on Step to Me, another diss track attacking NWA. The lyrics also made reference to an infamous incident involving NWA's Dr. Dre and Pump It Up host Dee Barnes. Barnes had accused Dre of assaulting her after Pump It Up had edited an NWA interview to include disparaging comments made by Ice Cube, who was embroiled in a feud with his former group at the time. The single was released by Rough House Records, home to other artists such as Cypress Hill and Criss Cross, and became a worldwide underground hit in the clubs and hip hop circles. Two versions of the music video were released, the original version and a censored edition. Penciling on Wax included several additional disses aimed at both Compton artists and commercially successful artists such as Kid and Play and Kwame. The intro used the same beat as NWA's Niggas for Life album intro. Tim taunted, I stole your beat and made it better to show the whole world that you ain't nothing but a bunch of pussy. Before a number of disparaging answer machine messages supported Tim's position as he rapped, wearing all that black, driving them cars, but you still look whack. In another skit, DJ Quick Beatdown, Tim Dog, quote, physically assaulted DJ Quick. Since the release, incoming responses came the following years from West Coast artists Snoop Dogg, DJ Quick, Compton's Most Wanted, Penthouse Players Clique, Rodney O, and Joe Cooley and Tweety Bird Loke. Tim followed up with his second album, Do or Die, in 1993. The album represented Tim's shift of focus away from confrontation with the West Coast and instead concentrated on on hardcore East Coast rap. The album contained a shout out to Tupac Shakur, who Tim thanked for assisting him when involved in a potentially violent situation when touring in California. One thing about Tupac Shakur is that if he felt like you were a friend of his, you know what I'm saying, he would ride with you. But the moment that you didn't reciprocate or he thought that you was like a phony, he ain't fuck with you no more. And think about that. Think about that for a second. If he felt like you were a phony, he didn't fuck with you no more. If he felt like you were not like him, a real nigga, he didn't fuck with you no more. Now think about that when you wonder why he was on the outs with Snoop toward the end. Um, in 1994, Tim Dog released the EP Bitch with a Perm. The second track, Dog Baby, was another diss to Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. In 1995, Tim moved to the United Kingdom and worked with UK artist Apache Indian, producing the hit single Make Way for the Indian. Tim then toured with Kool Keith and recorded several other tracks, including his August 2005 collaboration with Percy P, New York to the UK. Tim Dog had been the head of Rap Legends Recordings and previously co-founded Our Turn Records in Los Angeles with Eddie Pugh, president of Black Music Sony Records. Previously, he had been the CEO, president of Big Exidy Entertainment based in New York and BMC Management based in Atlanta. Now, some years later, Tim Dog was embroiled in legal issues. In 2011, Tim Dog pleaded guilty to grand larceny for conning a woman by the name of Esther Pilgrim out of $32,000 in an online dating scam. He was sentenced to 5 years probation and ordered to pay restitution of $19,000 to Pilgrim. The case was featured on the June 15th, 2012 episode of Dateline NBC, which clarified that it was a best interest plea. At this time, however, Tim Dog's health was beginning to deteriorate. The diabetes that he'd been suffering from for many years now was beginning to take its toll. He was suffering seizures, other complications, and after a hospitalization toward I think the beginning of 2013, he was released into hospice care, and he died on Valentine's Day 2013. However, the story doesn't necessarily end there as far as controversy. The funeral was canceled after his death, and a birth certificate or autopsy didn't exist. His family also stayed away from the media, claiming religious reasons as a justification for their shunning of the press and wanting to mourn in private. Now, at this time, before his death, Tim Dog had kind of become, I don't want to say a nobody, but he wasn't really relevant in hip hop anymore. But when he died, it made the news, um, even international news, because he was over in UK for a while, right? Now, later that year, the victim of that scam, Esther Pilgrim, alleged that Tim Dog's reported death may have been a scheme by Tim Dog to avoid payments to her. She became public, demanding further investigation into his death. A warrant was issued in Mississippi for his arrest in case he was still alive. In September of the next year, 2014, it was finally confirmed by NBC News that Tim Dog had actually did die on February 14, 2013, as had been initially reported, but then disputed. A death certificate was filed in DeKalb County, Georgia, putting an end to speculation that he was still alive and trying to avoid his court mandated debts. Tim Dog was only 46 years old when he passed away. Um, Today, in my opinion, hip hop is a pale imitation of its former self. I think it's been hijacked from us and, taken over and heavily influenced by other entities, I'll just say, right? And it's oversaturated now with sexual content, criminality, and self hatred. And to me, hip hop peaked, I would say, around 1997, 1998. And afterwards, there was a slow but, inevitable and undeniable decline. And you could definitely see it by the mid 2000s. But before that, man, hip hop was a beautiful thing. And the East Coast did come back, you know, primarily. I mean, Nas did put out his classic album, Illmatic, and there were other hip hop East Coast artists, but to me, East Coast really started coming back as far as, prominence with Notorious B.I.G., Bad Boy, Craig Mack, that era. LL had came back to prominence. That's when you saw New York really come back and show we're still here and that we can still be profitable, that we're still relevant. So, in that way, Tim Dog woke up a sleeping giant, which was the New York uh, rap gang. You know what I'm saying? Um, but that goes to show you how much power the industry has and these record companies, especially back then. They made people convinced that the East Coast was dead, which in reality it was never. And it should never been about East Coast versus West Coast or the South versus the North or the Midwest versus this or that. It should never been about that anyway. Hip hop should be about unity, but it's a whole different video for another different subject, man. But tell me what you guys think.